Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Glad to be here.
So imagine you're a neuroscientist, right, and you're looking at this brightly lit brain scan.
Okay.
And the image shows a mind that is just utterly incapable of feeling empathy. Like a brain where the biological brakes on violent impulses have been physically severed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then you realize the brain belongs to a prolific serial killer. So the question is, are you looking at a tragic medical defect, or are you looking at a high-definition photograph of just pure biological evil?
That is a wild question.
Right. So today, we are unpacking these massive foundational pillars of the human experience for you. We're exploring this really intense but surprisingly civil debate between devout Christians and modern Satanists.
Which is fascinating all on its own.
Totally. We're going to decode the origins of your morality using ancient Egyptian scales and a psychological experiment involving an invisible princess. And we're going to ask why cruelty actually exists in the world.
It's a huge topic.
It is a profound ride today. But real quick, before we plunge into the deep end, if you like my channel, please subscribe and hit the like button.
Yeah. And before we really dig into the specific arguments from our stack of sources today, we need to establish a pretty critical ground rule for this deep dive.
Absolutely. Lay it out.
Because the texts and debates and documentaries we're analyzing today, they contain some highly charged, deeply personal, religious, and philosophical viewpoints.
Yeah, very heavy stuff.
Exactly. I mean, we're looking at everything from steadfast traditional Christianity all the way to modern non-theistic Satanism. So, just to be absolutely clear to you, the listener, we are not taking sides today.
Not at all.
Right. We are not endorsing any specific worldview here. Our mission is just strictly to report, analyze, and synthesize the intricate arguments that are contained in this original source material.
Exactly. We are just your guides on this weird philosophical safari.
I like that, a philosophical safari.
Right. But to really grasp the core conflict in these sources between the Christian worldview and atheism, or specifically Satanism, we have to start with how fundamentally differently these groups define one single word.
And that word is freedom.
Yes, freedom. When you look at the Satanists and the debate source, the very first thing that jumps out is that they do not believe in a literal, supernatural red guy with a pitchfork.
No subterranean lake of fire.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which kind of blew my mind at first, you know?
Yeah, well, they view Satan strictly as a literary symbol. They actually draw parallels to figures like Prometheus.
Oh, the guy who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
To them, Satan represents this romantic, countercultural rebellion against tyranny and absolute authority.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right, so in their framework, freedom is defined as the allowance of experience. It's the absolute autonomy to just walk your own path, make your own choices, and this is the really crucial half of the equation, take uncompromising personal responsibility for the outcomes.
Without leaning on, like, an external higher power to dictate your life or forgive your misstep.
Precisely. You own your choices.
Okay, but wait, I have to push back on that logic for a second.
Yeah.
If you just want to be an autonomous free thinker who takes personal responsibility, why pick the literal historical embodiment of cosmic evil as your mascot?
It does seem counterintuitive.
Right. Doesn't that just intentionally antagonize people for shock value?
Yeah.
I mean, why take on all the heavy cultural baggage of that label instead of just calling yourself an atheist?
Well, that is the exact question posed to them in the debate. And one of the Satanists explains the rationale brilliantly, I think.
What do you say?
He points out that the new atheism movement of the 1990s and early 2000s, led by figures like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens, it was a highly effective hammer.
A hammer.
Yeah, it was great at breaking down old religious systems and exposing logical flaws in dogma. But as a human movement, it was incomplete. It left a huge cultural void.
Because humans aren't just logic machines. We need more than just tearing things down.
Exactly. We inherently need symbols. We require rituals, community, and overarching narratives to make sense of the chaos of our lives.
So just gathering in a room and saying, hey, we agree that we don't believe in God, that wasn't enough connective tissue.
Right. It's not enough to build a lasting community around. So they adopted a provocative symbol of self-ownership to fill that post-atheistic void. They used the mythos of rebellion to bond them together.
That is super interesting. But then you have the Christian perspective sitting across the table, and they completely reject that definition of freedom.
Oh, entirely.
Yeah, the Christians argue that absolute autonomy, just, following your every impulse, it doesn't lead to liberation. It leads to captivity.
Yeah, one of the pastors shared his own history with that.
He did. He talked about chasing every desire, partying, doing whatever he pleased, and he described it as feeling like hell on earth. It led directly to addictions, deep bitterness, and paralyzing anxiety.
Because in their view, God's rules aren't designed to oppress you.
Right. They are designed to protect you from your own destructive nature.
Yes, the Christian argument posits that true freedom is actually found within boundaries. They view the divine structure as a loving parent who stops a toddler from touching a hot stove.
Okay, let me try an analogy to visualize this for you. It's like a playground right next to a busy 6-lane highway.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The Christians are saying God is the chain link fence. Sure, the fence limits how far you can run, but it keeps you from wandering into traffic and getting hit by a semi-truck.
And that safety is what allows you to truly play freely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the Satanists are looking at the exact same scenario and saying, I have the intellectual and moral autonomy to look both ways before I cross the street. I don't need the fence.
I see where you're going with that, but I think the Satanists in the source material would actually challenge that analogy.
Oh, really? How so?
They would argue that God isn't just a fence keeping you off a dangerous highway. He's a fence keeping you from exploring the vast, beautiful forest on the other side.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. To them, the fence isn't safety, it's a cage. It restricts the full spectrum of human experience out of fear.
That is a critical distinction.
Yeah.
But if we follow that thread, like if we completely remove the fence, and if we own ourselves entirely, as the Satanists suggest, who steps in when my self-interest violently collides with yours?
That's the big question.
Think about the last time someone dangerously cut you off in traffic and you felt that sudden righteous flash of anger. Where does that "how dare they" instinct come from? Without a divine rule book, what stops humanity from tearing itself apart?
And now we have arrived at the classic philosophical battleground of subjective versus objective morality.
Right, because the Satanists in the room argue that morality is entirely subjective, but grounded in evolutionary biology and human empathy.
Yeah, one of them mentions that his moral compass didn't come from ancient scriptures.
No, it came from reading thousands of science fiction books by authors like Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov.
Which is such a unique source of morality.
It really is.
Yeah.
His point is that you don't need a holy text to deduce that murder is detrimental.
Yeah.
We are a social species. We naturally evolve to want the best for our community because our personal survival depends on the survival of the tribe.
But the Christian counterargument zeroes in on the terrifying fragility of that subjective morality.
Like fragility.
Yeah, they argue that without an unchanging objective cosmic standard, namely God morality is ultimately just a personal opinion.
Oh, I see.
Because if right and wrong are simply based on whatever society agrees upon at the time, well, history is filled with societies that reached a consensus on horrific things.
Like slavery or genocide.
Exactly. One Christian analyst put it incredibly bluntly. He said, without a divine lawgiver saying, I dislike murder, holds the exact same cosmic weight as saying, I dislike pizza.
Wow.
Yeah, it's just a localized preference.
Which is such a striking way to frame it. But here is where we look at the actual mechanics of human behavior, because we have fascinating psychological data on this exact instinct.
Oh, from the Morgan Freeman documentary Source.
Yes. The source detailing Morgan Freeman's exploration of evil introduces us to psychologist Jesse Bering and his famous Princess Alice experiment.
This study is a brilliant look at the mechanics of human honesty.
It's brilliantly simple. So, researchers put young children in a room with a game where they have to throw Velcro balls at a target to win a prize.
All right.
But the catch is, the rules state they have to throw the balls with their backs facing the target, which makes winning almost impossible.
Right.
So when the adult researchers leave the room, hidden cameras capture the kids doing exactly what you'd expect.
They cheat.
They cheat. They turn around, step over the line, and just stick the balls directly onto the target with their hands because they want the candy, and they are certain they are completely alone.
Typical kids. But then the researchers run the experiment again with a new group of kids, changing just one variable.
The best part.
Before leaving the room, the adult points to an empty chair in the corner and tells the children, there is an invisible, magical being named Princess Alice sitting right there, and she is watching everything you do.
And the hidden cameras reveal a shocking shift in behavior. The kids do not cheat.
Not at all.
Some of them even wave nervously at the empty chair. I mean, just the mere idea of an invisible watcher completely overrode their selfish desire for the prize. Honestly, I'm an adult, and if you told me an invisible woman named Princess Alice was watching me parallel park, I'd probably do a much better job.
It's funny, but the evolutionary implications are profound.
How so?
If we look at the why behind this behavior, anthropologists suggest that as humans evolved from living in small tribes of 50 people, where everyone literally was watching you all the time, into building massive cities with thousands of strangers, we gained anonymity.
And anonymity breeds bad behavior.
Precisely. So does humanity inherently need the psychological concept of an all-seeing God to maintain social order in large civilizations?
It acts as an internal policing mechanism.
Exactly. And this isn't some new psychological trick discovered in a modern lab. This concept has been the mechanical bedrock of human civilization for millennia.
Oh, like the Egyptian tomb from the sources.
Yes. In the sources, we visit the ancient Egyptian tomb of Mena, dating back to 1370 BC.
Over 3,000 years ago.
Yes. Painted on the walls of this tomb is a detailed depiction of the afterlife. It shows a person's physical heart being placed on a scale and weighed against the feather of truth.
The feather of truth, wow.
The mechanism was clear. If you lied, stole, or committed evil in secret, your heart grew physically heavy with those deeds. If it weighed more than the feather, a monster devoured your soul.
So the idea that an invisible force watches our hidden moments and eventually balances the scales, that's been stabilizing human societies for at least 300 to 500 years.
It really has.
But introducing an all-knowing watcher inevitably forces us into the most difficult terrain of this entire discussion. Because if there's an all-knowing, all-loving watcher, why does he let the scale get so unbalanced in the first place?
Yeah, why is the world saturated with such horrific cruelty?
Exactly. The problem of evil. It is the heaviest, most agonizing emotional core of the debate between the Christians and the Satanists.
The atmosphere in the room completely shifted when one of the Satanists, a man named Michael, shared a deeply traumatic personal story.
Yeah, that was tough to watch.
He revealed that his own son had been murdered. And he looked directly at the Christians and asked, where was God's protective love the day someone beat his son to death?
It's an impossible question to hear.
It is. And from that unimaginable trauma, Michael concluded that there is no invisible watcher. The universe is just cold, mechanical, and entirely indifferent to human suffering.
It is a devastating reality to confront. And the Christian response to Michael's pain relies entirely on the architecture of free will.
Right.
They argue that for love and goodness to mean anything, God had to give humanity the ultimate autonomy to choose. You cannot force a robot to love you.
But that autonomy sadly includes the capacity for humans to choose to inflict horrific evil upon one another.
Right. Their faith, however, rests on the promise of ultimate restoration, that God grieves that pain alongside them, will execute perfect justice eventually, and possesses the power to somehow redeem even the most senseless tragedies.
But I want to pivot away from philosophy for a second and ask a question raised by the scientific sources.
Okay, let's hear it.
What if the violent actions that cause this immense suffering aren't a product of spiritual free will at all? What if it's not a choice made by a corrupted soul, but just, well, broken biological plumbing?
Oh man, that is the exact frontier neuroscientist Dr. Kent Keel is exploring.
Yes.
In the documentary Source, Dr. Keel takes us inside the walls of a maximum security prison. He has dedicated his career to scanning the brains of over 800 incarcerated psychopaths.
800? That's a massive data set.
It is, and he sits down with one specific inmate who scores in the 99th percentile for psychopathy. This man is a serial rapist and a murderer.
And when he was asked why he committed these atrocities, his answer was chilling.
He essentially said it was an overwhelming impulse he couldn't stop. But the most unsettling part was his complete lack of remorse.
He explicitly stated, I'm not wired the same as everybody else.
Yeah, he felt no empathy for the lives he destroyed.
And the MRI scans proved that he was telling the biological truth.
They absolutely did.
Yeah.
To understand the how of this, we have to look at how a healthy brain processes anger.
Okay, break it down.
Think of a normal brain's orbitofrontal cortex as a sophisticated braking system. When a normal person gets furious, a primitive part of the brain called the amygdala hits the gas pedal. You want to lash out.
Right, the fight or flight response.
Exactly. But instantly, the orbital frontal cortex hits the brakes by rapidly simulating the future consequences of violence, like prison, guilt, the pain of the victim.
It creates empathy.
Right. But Dr. Keel's scans showed that in this inmate, the orbital frontal cortex was severely underdeveloped. It was physically atrophied.
The brake lines were literally cut.
Yes. When his amygdala hit the gas, there was no biological mechanism to stop the violent impulse.
Which creates a paralyzing ethical dilemma.
Seriously.
If a person is biologically, physically incapable of feeling empathy because their frontal cortex failed to grow properly in the womb, is their behavior evil? Or is it a tragic medical defect?
It completely disrupts our justice system. Dr. Keel suggests that as neuroscience advances, we might soon have the technology to scan kids as young as 10 or 12 to predict who has this atrophy and is at high risk for severe psychopathy.
Wow.
The goal would be to treat the brain chemically before they ever commit a crime. But think about the dystopian implications of that. Diagnosing a child with potential evil based on a brain scan long before they've ever done anything wrong.
It totally shatters the ancient paradigm of a demon whispering in your ear or a soul actively choosing darkness.
It really does. But regardless of whether evil stems from a spiritual failing, a biological glitch, or just a lifetime of terrible choices, society still has to figure out how to interact with the people who commit it.
And our sources reveal a profound divide on how to process that darkness.
We see a stark, undeniable contrast between the pursuit of vengeance and the discipline of forgiveness.
Returning to the Christian and Satanist debate, the moderator asked how they handle being deeply wronged by someone.
And the Satanists were unwavering. Forgiveness is not an entitlement. If you wrong them, a moral debt is incurred.
Yeah, one of them stated bluntly that if you cross a certain line of disrespect, I am going to scorch the earth between us.
Scorch the earth. That's intense.
For them, it is a matter of preserving personal dignity and enforcing strict boundary.
The Christian view presented is the exact inverse. One pastor explained that because he believes God absorbed and freely forgave his own massive, destructive life choices, he is spiritually obligated to extend that exact same unmerited mercy to others.
Even those who intentionally hurt him.
Yeah. It's not about giving the offender what they logically deserve. It's about short-circuiting the endless human cycle of retribution.
And we actually see an incredible, agonizing physical manifestation of that desire for redemption in the story of Brian from the documentary.
Brian's story is so intense.
It is. By his own admission, Brian was a former neo-Nazi enforcer who lived a life of utter destruction. He was deeply entrenched in violent white supremacy, and his face and neck were heavily covered in tattooed hate symbols.
Right.
He described his former self as borderline sociopathic, a man who just wanted to inflict his own internal pain onto the world.
But then a biological and emotional trigger changed everything. He had a son.
Right. Holding his child forced him to look in the mirror, and he realized he could not pass that legacy of hatred down to another generation. He made the radical choice to change.
But to make his outside appearance match his internal shift, he subjected himself to 2.5 years of excruciating laser tattoo removal on his face.
2.5 years?
Yeah, and he described the pain as ungodly. But crucially, he didn't ask for painkillers.
Wait, really?
Yeah, he treated the physical agony of the laser as a necessary penance. He felt he deserved to endure that pain as a payment for the hurt he had caused society.
And he ultimately credited his internal transformation to a newfound belief in a godly presence that finally filled the dark, angry hole in his soul.
It's a staggering testament to the human capacity to pivot away from the worst versions of ourselves. And, it's also worth noting how beautifully other cultures globally handle this concept of purging the darkness.
Yes, the concept of evil isn't universally viewed as a war against a literal devil. In Varanasi, India, the source highlights Hindu rituals where suffering, bad luck, or sickness aren't attributed to demonic possession.
What are they attributed to?
Well, they believe these struggles are caused by unhappy, restless ancestral spirits. So rather than fighting an enemy, they perform compassionate rituals.
Offering food and water, really.
Exactly, to heal and pacify those spirits. The mechanical goal is literally to convert bad energy back into good energy.
And then you have Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest monotheistic religions in the world. They believe there is no external devil figure at all.
Right.
The cosmic battle between good and evil isn't happening in the clouds. It is fought entirely inside the human mind, every single minute of every day, through the strict discipline of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds.
It places the ultimate burden of personal responsibility right back onto the individual to purge the evil within themselves, rather than scapegoating an external supernatural force.
So, synthesizing everything we've explored today, we started with a modern satanic view of defining freedom as absolute unbridled autonomy, completely detached from the protective or restrictive fences of traditional religion.
Yeah.
We examined how the psychological weight of an invisible watcher, whether it's the ancient Egyptian gods weighing a literal heart on a scale, or a fake Princess Alice in a modern laboratory, mechanically dictates our moral choices and allows civilizations to function.
And we've looked at the very physical, neurological braking system of a psychopath's brain.
which deeply challenges the ancient spiritual idea of free will.
It really does. And all of these colliding realities lead me to one final, completely new philosophical wrinkle I want to leave you to mull over.
Well, okay, hit me.
We've talked about the Christian demand for free will and the neurological reality of broken brain wiring. But imagine a future where medical science invents a simple daily pill that perfectly regrows the orbitofrontal cortex and permanently cures psychopathy.
Okay.
If we take a violent, remorseless serial killer and legally force him to take that pill against his will to make him good, are we violating the very concept of free will that traditional religion says is necessary for genuine love?
Oh, wow.
If human morality simply becomes a matter of biological engineering and taking the right medication, does the profound spiritual concept of redemption even exist anymore?
That is an incredibly heavy paradox to chew on. Is the diagnostic landscape of our souls really just waiting to be cured by a pharmacy? Thank you for joining us as we unpack these monumental ideas. Keep questioning your assumptions, keep exploring the mechanics of why we do what we do, and most importantly, keep thinking deeper. Catch you next time.